ClayFighter is a series of video games that began on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in 1993. It was released only about a month after Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas arrived in movie theaters. Claymation was at peak popularity, and when ClayFighter came on the scene, combining the fighting style of Street Fighter II, digitized photographic sprites, albeit of clay characters, in the style of Mortal Kombat, and its own slightly darker, grittier characters with a comedic splash, gamers really didn't know what to expect. But ClayFighter definitely turned heads as all stop-motion claymation was reaching new heights. Personally, I was thrilled. From the first time I saw ClayFighter, I was hooked, and I would go on to own every game in the franchise. The original ClayFighter for the SNES plays reasonably well. After finding a very short preview video online, I was able to see that there was once a time when Ichabod Clay was named Ghost Guy, Blue Suede Goo was simply called Impersonator, and even Taffy was Taffy Man. Also, I noticed little vertical meters to the sides of the names and health bars, but these were removed from the final game. Beyond the ridiculous looping intro song, which never got old to me, the music is good and matches the environments fairly well. The music fits the characters fit their levels, the sound effects are zany and fit the universe that they're placed in, and the characters are fully voice acted. And although there's a bit of fuzziness due to compression, there is a large sampling of goofy quips and one-liners along with all the crazy sound effects to match. The Genesis version of the first ClayFighter shocked me. It played much faster and smoother than the Super Nintendo original, and the sounds were actually slightly more crisp. Unfortunately, however, the level backgrounds were not as detailed. There seemed to be a smaller variety of sound effects overall, and the music left players who were familiar with the SNES version wanting more. Still, as far as gameplay itself is concerned, the Genesis port, despite being handled by a different team, actually outperforms the Super NES version by quite a wide margin. While I couldn't find any definitive information about it, it seems that the original ClayFighter employed some compression methods. The game tends to experience some load times, likely due to having to decompress sound or graphics somewhere along the line. Still, the gameplay in the original game seemed good enough for most players at the time. That is, until they got their hands on ClayFighter Tournament Edition. This game included more memory, which allowed everything, including gameplay, to run much more smoothly, and it finally seems to become the definitive version of ClayFighter. It really was a night and day difference. One thing I noticed in the options menu was that ClayFighter Tournament Edition started the game at speed level 4. Adjusting the original ClayFighter from 1 to 4 made it play a little faster, but it was still nowhere near as smooth as the game ran with the new hardware upgrade. Tournament Edition included a few extra moves and levels and an entire legitimate tournament mode with a bracketing system. Everything about it was just that much more refined. It also included our first real in-game nod to the story of ClayFighter, which I'll introduce now.
Guy.
Come on, baby.
Now we're getting somewhere. The very first game, both on the Genesis and SNES, suggested that the ClayFighters were mostly just involved in these fights in order to become king of the circus. That was about it as far as in-game story was concerned. Then came the sequel, which turned up the heat.
ClayFighter 2, Judgment Play! We're back!
Unfortunately, when it comes to heat, I'm not talking about in-game story. ClayFighter 2 Judgment Clay seems to have even less than the first game. One thing you will realize, though, by unlocking more and more characters in the game, is that the designers definitely had big ideas. They They had so many catchphrases and special moves and animations and even names for their characters that they decided that they wouldn't just limit themselves to one small roster. Each character in the game is given an evil twin, so to speak. For the most part, these are just palette swaps of their existing selves, but they oftentimes adopt new fighting stances to help tell them apart. And also, their movesets vary drastically from the original inspirations. Each one of these doppelgangers is given a new name, and they're portrayed with a different voice. You can tell that the writer's room was so full of ideas that they had no idea how they were going to chalk so many into the game. Graphically, the sprite animations are a little sloppier, and the overall digitization of the new clay models didn't go as well. Game developers are on record in some interviews complaining about the quality of the graphical imports of the new characters, and to prove their point, Tiny was added late to the game, reusing his old assets. To see Tiny's old assets imported into the game using the new tools really makes you appreciate the evolution the game took from one generation to the next. I remember asking myself as a kid why Tiny had to be the best looking character, because he was my least favorite and the least interesting. But this was done to prove a point, so that the developers could go back to Danger Productions, who had assisted with assets in the first game, when they made their next sequel. Which, indeed they did. ClayFighter 63 1/3 released in October of 1997, and featured a roster made up almost entirely of new characters. Although some return from the first game, almost nobody exclusively from C2 shows up, and a host of new characters were worked on but had to be omitted from the original release. Then additional characters were brought in. What I mean by additional is interplay properties. Boogerman and Earthworm Jim make an appearance in this game, and they aren't kept a secret for very long. If you pop ClayFighter 63 1/3 into your Nintendo 64 and let it sit, usually the first character bio you will encounter is that of Earthworm Jim. Within his bio is a hint that Boogerman is also in the game. The music is so-so, and the graphics, while improved, suffer some of the same problems they had experienced with C2 Judgment Clay. When the clay models were turned into sprites, some aliasing or jagged edges were left over. They're not too bad, but they could definitely be a little better. The levels are expansive, but broken into sections, like a Mortal Kombat game. If characters get too far apart, the camera will zoom out, and the game's draw distance can't always make up for it, making it even more strange that most levels start with some kind of zoom-in effect. This game takes the fighting style of the first two and dials it up. Control schemes feel straight out of Street Fighter. Claytalities have been added as a nod to Mortal Kombat, and a combo system which includes basic openers and linkers feels very much like it wishes it were Killer Instinct. Unfortunately, it doesn't really get close to any of those. Where the game shines is by having an all-star voice cast, including voice actors known for work on classic cartoons such as Animaniacs and The Simpsons by way of Tress MacNeille, Frank Welker, and Dan Castellaneta. The downside is that many of the characters were given the same lines to read, so even though you're hearing different voices, the phrases could have been better improvised by the cast they had, rather than just everybody reading the same sheet of insults over and over. The definitive version of the game was released in 1998 as ClayFighter Sculptor's Cut. Characters which had to be scrapped from the original were added back, the voice acting gets dialed up another notch, and the graphics are further enhanced. New character bios are given at the start of the game, and the endings are slightly altered as well. Similar to how ClayFighter Tournament Edition had a different and more detailed introduction than the original ClayFighter, Sculptor's Cut treats us to a short song as an introduction to the game, whereas the original 63 1/3 just relied on character bios to introduce you to the universe.
A meteor crash one fateful day turned mud-little creatures into clay, with heroes bent on doing right and twisted foes up for the fight. ClayFighter!
1-to-1 they set the stage.
ClayFighter!
Pounding clay is all the
That
rage.
may have been all to the tale, but Dr. Kiln planned to prevail and re-release the meteor's goo and set more fighters on the loose. ClayFighter!
They punch and kick and they do tricks.
ClayFighter!
Some are made as hard as bricks.
Soul killing grins from ear to ear, Claymoto Isle just quakes in fear, but none of our heroes have their way and force the evil goons to pay. ClayFighter! Blow by blow, no turning back. ClayFighter! Living mud on the attack, but who will win the final match?
I always knew that doing a fighting game would be difficult. This show is called Our Story So Far, and with every character having their own backstory, their own reason for fighting, and their own ending, how do you cover the story of a fighting game? Thankfully, the game made that decision a little easier. It's not until the Nintendo 64 era that storylines for characters even begin to become prevalent. In fact, to know your character's stories in the 16-bit titles, you're required to beat the game on hard difficulty. If you beat the game on easy, you don't even seem to get the credits. Beating the game on normal shows credits, and beating the game on hard gives you that character's storied ending. The Nintendo 64 at least gives some form of an ending, although I suspect you get a more detailed ending by beating the game on a harder difficulty. And apart from the King of the Circus bit from the very first game, it's hard to discuss a story in the ClayFighter universe, and that's because they're all found, such as they are, in the instruction manuals. The good news is, we won't necessarily be here forever. Despite there being black and white versions, color versions, the original, the Genesis, the Tournament Edition, the text in each of these manuals is identical, so I only have to worry about sequels. So let's dig in. An abandoned amusement park sits peacefully in the noonday sun. Playland was once the most popular vacation spot in all of Mudville. These days, it is only home to dust and cobwebs. This, however, is about to change. From a bajillion miles away comes a mysterious purple clay meteor. It approaches, seemingly with purpose, rocketing towards the center of the park. With deafening impact, the meteor explodes, spreading clay devastation throughout the park. Playland has become Clayland. Hours later, as the smoke begins to clear and the years of dust resettle, something stirs. From the twisted ruins of Playland, a mighty warrior emerges, and then another and another, each the product of the strange meteor and circus rubble, each with only one thought in their soft clay brains. Become king of the circus. The road to become king of the circus will not be an easy one. The clay fighter who wants this title will have to be stronger, smarter, and trickier than all the others. Who will it be? Blue Suede Goo with his hair blade, Ichabod Clay and his Ectoball, Helga, Bonker, Tiny, Blob, or Taffy? Each clay fighter was given special powers and abilities by the meteor. Some abilities even they don't know about. You'll need to explore these unknown abilities if you wish to claim the title, King of the Circus. Dateline, Mudville, July 15th, 1994. Authorities have now confirmed the mysterious purple clay meteor that recently wreaked havoc through the land is once again active. Clay emissions from the meteor have been seen spreading through Mudville at an alarming rate, leaving the land flooded in a sea of rising clay. One eyewitness described the spreading clay as a gigantic blanket of bubbling goo covering the... Unfortunately, the witness was not able to finish before being engulfed by a gushing mass of clay. It is believed that moments before this second claytastrophe began, an alien spacecraft in the shape of a prune Danish landed approximately 1/4 of a mile away from the meteor. Witnesses described a strange man with a big head, large, buggy eyes, wearing a lab coat with the inscription, "Extremely Mad Scientist Dr. Kiln," jumping out of the craft. According to one startled citizen, Dr. Kiln pressed his nose, and out of both nostrils shot a big honking loogie. It was large and green and struck the central portion of the meteor. The meteor instantly pulsed with a strange green glow and began spewing forth the dreaded clay emissions. Then Dr. Kiln shouted at the top of his lungs, "I am now and will remain supreme ruler of all Mudville. N-Boss is no more, and just try and stop me." The most recent reports indicate that an array of formidable warriors has risen from the spreading sea of clay, apparently to meet Dr. Kiln's challenge and vie for supreme leader themselves. These clay fighters are believed to be far stronger and fiercer than those that rocked Mudville during the last claytastrophe. Who of these new warriors will finally triumph and rule the land? Hoppy, a rowdy bunny? Buff and bad, Mr. Frosty? Maybe it will be Blob, Goo Goo, Nanaman, Octo, Kangoo, or last year's champion, Tiny. It all depends on you. Are you ready? The C2 manual certainly has some interesting tidbits within its pages. It directly states that Tiny was the winner of the first ClayFighter game, and calls out N-Boss, a character seen at the end of the first game, whose single initial first name is clearly just a joke on End Boss, as in the boss at the end of the game. Still, it is a thread that ties the two games together. Let's see where the Nintendo 64 takes us. Chaos on Claymodo. The Isle of Claymodo is the resting place of Bessie, the purple meteor that came crashing out of the sky onto Claymodo Island. Bessie has the essential ingredient, bok choy, necessary for Dr. Kiln's world-dominating mutagen. Claymodo's chief baddies are the devious Dr. Kiln and local voodooist Happy Harry Hungan. With a combination of laboratory experiments and voodoo spells, they've created an interesting assortment of hooligans to help them take over the world. These hideous henchmen include Bonker, a clown gone bad, and Ichabod Clay, the wonder from down under. Dr. Kiln is putting the final touches on his top-secret mutagen, codenamed Chaotic Claymorphosis, as Hungan walks through the lab door. When Hungan finds out about Dr. Kiln's secret formula, the clay hits the fan. As the fight breaks loose, the vial containing the mutagen breaks in Dr. Kiln's hand, and it begins to take on a life of its own. The condition begins to spread rapidly, and Dr. Kiln has no choice but to amputate his own hand. As the hand hits the floor, it scurries out of the lab and into the dense jungle of Claymodo. Hungan quickly exits the lab in pursuit of the hand as Dr. Kiln writhes in pain. Meanwhile, as Dr. Kiln deals with his newfound stump, a ship on a 3-hour tour capsizes just off of Rubbage Reef. The ship contains a lively crew of characters, each with their own agendas. There's Bad Mr. Frosty, a one-time bad guy who's turned his life around, and Kung Pao, a wok cookery Chef Boyar Clay. Taffy Man and Blob round out the castaways of the SS Manure. Mudville seems to be a thing of the past, and Chaos and Claymodo are spelled with K's, even though the game is spelled with a C and has had no reason up until this point to use K's. The purple meteor has relocated, and there's no mention of Dr. Kiln bringing the meteor to Claymodo Island. Throw in a Gilligan's Island joke certain to go over the heads of most 90s kids, and a poop joke for a ship name, and we can see that ClayFighter 63 1/3's target audience isn't young boys, but rather immature young adults. But we're not quite done yet. Now, for those unfamiliar with the retro games collecting community, Sculptor's Cut is known to be one of the most rare Nintendo 64 titles. I'm honored enough to have the box and the game, but the manual is way out of my price range. That being said, today I'm going to rely on a scan of the manual found over at the Nintendo Age forums. I originally didn't plan on doing this, but when I discovered there were some significant differences between the two manuals, I thought it was worth a look. Chaos on Claymodo, this time spelled with C's. Hidden deep in the oceans of the world of Claydonia lies the tiny isle of Claymodo, a lush, jungle-covered spot that has never been plotted on any map. It is here that the evil Dr. Kiln has set up his secret base, adding the finishing touches to his plan of world domination. Meanwhile, our heroes were gently flying via jet plane to the Clayhamas, a vacation paradise that all have been looking forward to greatly. The recently turned good Bad Mr. Frosty, world-famous chef Kung Pao, master claymorphosist Blob, freedom fighter Lady Liberty, and Taffy, the Candyman, were all enjoying their roasted peanuts and complimentary half can of soda when, out of the clear blue sky, a huge purple meteor came screaming toward our ill-fated bunch and knocked their jet out of the air, causing them to crash onto the small island of Claymodo. Upon discovering Dr. Kiln's intentions, they immediately went on the crusade to stop the madman. As the brave bunch formulated a strategy to foil the evildoers, Hungan, Dr. Kiln's evil scientist, was working on his secret world domination formula, when Big Bessie, the huge meteor that nearly barbecued our valiant warriors, embedded itself in the volcano that doubled as Hungan's secret lab with a thunderous crash. Fortunately for Dr. Kiln, some of the radioactive goop that splashed off the enormous meteor fell on Dr. Kiln's hand, and it immediately started to grow larger and larger. Dr. Kiln realized with horror that his hand had taken on a life of its own. He had but one choice: sever the hand that was mutating into a new life form. Although Dr. Kiln's hand removal surgery, which was done with a chainsaw, was painful, he realized with glee that he could create a vast army of warriors with which to take over the world. Dr. Kiln's maniacal plans were to be cut short, however. The hand, now known as High Five, was tired of always bending to Dr. Kiln's will and decided to join in the fight against him. Dr. Kiln was not so easily foiled, however. With the meteorite mutagen, he created his henchman, Lockjaw, his loyal and sinister pooch, and Ichabod Clay, a yet unknown type of clay specter. When Bonker, the mischievous clown, caught wind of Dr. Kiln's dastardly plan, he immediately joined the evil Dr. Kiln's cause, wanting nothing more than to cause havoc on the world of Claydonia. The Zappa Yow Yow boys, the only natives to Claymodo, want nothing more than to get all of these crazy idiots off of their island. Who will win this glorious battle of good versus evil? Only you can decide the outcome. I knew coming into this would be a lengthy episode, but I absolutely love the ClayFighter saga of games. Ever since I was a kid, I was that weird one who didn't love it because it was a fighting game, and I didn't even love it for its humor. I just love it because it's different. It was weird, and I was drawn to that. I was drawn to stop-motion, clay-fighting action. But the story for this franchise is ultimately too confusing. I wanted to think of ClayFighter 63 1/3 as the reboot of the franchise, but it specifically references C2 Judgment Clay and Ichabod Clay's bio, and talks about Bad Mr. Frosty's backwards cap look from the second game. Characters like Bonker are a complete revamp of what they once looked like, and some characters have their own story arcs. Unless you're the kind of glutton for punishment who's willing to work through each of their favorite characters and play through a series of games with clunky controls, repetitive sound effects, and oftentimes mediocre animations, ClayFighter might not be the series for you. The lore seems to contradict itself and confuse you more than it helps. It's hard to know what they want you to think of each character, and even harder to keep track of why you should bother. It took all the way until Sculptor's Cut to get an even remotely cohesive story put together for the universe. We finally know what planet it takes place on and the name of the uncharted island, but does that mean Mudville and the King of the Circus tournament never took place at Clayland? ClayFighter games have a cult following, and I'm firmly entrenched in that cult, because I have fond memories of visually interesting characters. But it's certainly never been about our story so far. Thanks everyone for watching episode 48 of Our Story So Far. I'm literally losing my voice, I've been recording this for so long. Anyway, if you appreciate all my efforts, I would really appreciate you if you would give me a like on this video, or subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, or tell a friend to subscribe. That would really help me out and make me feel a little bit better after all this effort. You can always leave a comment below, or if you want to talk to me somewhere else, @NewAngel on Twitter. That's NUANGEL. If you're looking for more just like this, OurStorySoFar.tv has every episode archived in 1080p quality, and as always, I'll try to have a new episode ready for you again in 2 weeks. Until next time, take care of yourself.